people get into property ownership creatively, maybe taking a few steps before getting to that dream home. And there was a housing crisis already in Caslo at the time. So now, a year later, we're definitely the housing crisis has become even more of an issue, and there's been a lot of talk about this across the country. So definitely excited to hear about kind of the updates of where things are moving and what you're recommending to your clients right now. For
Oh, thank you so much, Maria. This is great. I really like the opportunity. And it's exciting to talk to people about thinking outside the box, because I feel it's important that people own properties if they can. Um, I am a good believer that the lands in Canada should be owned by private people. The more private people that own property, the more say that we have over what happens to our country. Um, so I've lived in Caslo for the last, I think, almost 35 years. I was born in India, grew up in Toronto, and then came here in 1990, totally by accident. Was not planning to be in a small little town. Our population is about 1,000, and we're in the southeast corner of BC. And it takes about 8 hours to drive to Calgary, 8 hours to Vancouver. Um, and living in a small town, you kind of got to go with the flow. There's not always a lot of jobs. You got to create your own anything kind of to get you by. And so did lots of things, worked at hotels, did waitressing. We ended up buying a cable company, and we did a little talk show on our community channel. And that, I think, really got me thinking of how different people are and the different needs. But everybody needs housing. And without a housing, you don't have the security, and you don't have the security, it's really hard to raise kids, plan for your future, do all of those kinds of things. So it was really interesting to see how people were managing to do things. I think when I first moved here, this area is one of the last sort of wild, wild west places. We had a very underground economy. There was lots of bartering and trading happening. Um, I have a brother-in-law who I think is probably one of the last people that squatted on Crown land and still does.
Hmm,
And the hoops that he had to jump through to be allowed to stay there.
yeah.
So they would never give him ownership, but they did start charging him taxes. And he was able to live there until he dies. He's not allowed to will it or sell it or do anything like
Mhm.
that. So that was really interesting to think that if people got the time and the energy, there are ways to navigate through things. Um,
Yeah, yeah. And I think one of the things also that I found so interesting about your story is your parents being immigrants to Toronto. They had kind of a creative journey as well of how
that's
they got
right.
into property ownership.
That's right. And so when they moved to Canada, it was hard. You don't know the language, you do whatever you need to do. And what they decided was they needed to get into home ownership, and they didn't have enough funds to buy it. But there was another family who were also immigrants, and they were in the same boat. So both parents thought about buying a house together. And then the other family lived upstairs. We lived on the main floor. And we lived like that for, I want to say, 2 years until they were able to build some equity. So they did some fixing up to the house. The market got a little bit better. This was in 1976 or something like that. And then they sold the house, and the equity that they had built, they split it. And that gave each family enough down payment to buy their own houses. And yeah, and what a great way. So it's not maybe the most ideal because you are sharing spaces. There has to be some boundaries and things like that set up. But the goal was to own a home, and that superseded anything else, any
And you
hardship.
got there. Yeah, you got there quite quickly. Yeah.
Yes.
So that's
So that
that's
is one of the things I think is great, whatever our main goals are, to keep them in focus. But you don't have to maybe get there all at once if you can't, right? Like you can take some steps and take a deep breath and keep your eye on the main goal.
for sure. Yeah. And I think so you've helped a lot of your clients get into kind of that path of towards their dream home, and maybe that's their first step or their second step. Can you talk about some of the different kind of creative ways that you've seen people do in your area?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things I do know, and I think everybody's experiencing that, when you're a first time home buyer in today's world, it's it's beyond hard. If you don't have family that can help you, or you haven't been, working at a well-paying job for a number of years to establish good credit with the banks, it's very, very hard to get going. And so young people, and especially young people, it's like if you can own property rather than starting at 50 years old, like
Mhm.
you have a lot more
Earlier,
potential
yeah.
and options. So I've been working with first-time home buyers, and I mean, definitely you need a mortgage, so you need to have a job, and you need to be able to provide 3 years of employment confirmation to the bank. Then it was talking to the first time it was three. I was talking to three separate young couples, and every property that they looked at, they just couldn't. They didn't have the down payment, or it was out of their budget, and they were feeling very deflated about it. And then I was thinking, well, I should get them all together. And so I did. And so I told them the story of my parents, of this is what they did, and said, yes, you can't buy a house on your own, but instead of sitting there and thinking that it's off the table, buy it with somebody. And it was daunting because then it's like, well, what if we don't get along? You hear about divorce cases all the time and
Of
things like
course.
that where people
Yeah.
are in relationships and how bad it can go, right? And I was like, but if you all know that those are the possibilities, well, let's start there first. Let's start of what are we going to do if you don't like each other? What are you going to do if a couple splits up and then the one person can't afford it on their own anymore? Like, what are all of the things that could break this? List them and let's find solutions for them. And I think that was the most interesting thing for me because you talk about the bad things first and you come up with solutions. And once people look at each other eye to eye and work it out, people want to be tentative about it. But I was like, no, just act like you hate each other. So what are you going to do?
Worst
And
case
that,
scenario. Yeah.
yeah. And you work it through. And then we did have to engage a lawyer, make sure that it was all written out. Because the scariest part is if somebody wants out for whatever reason, they
Mhm.
should be
Then
able
what
to get
happens?
out.
Yeah.
And how are the other people going to cope with it? Um, And that set it up really nicely, and people were willing to take the risk and the
Mhm.
chance of making it work. And their goal was for, figuring out their finances, like if they keep working and then they have this is what they could do to add value to the property, keep an eye on the market.
Mhm.
And then they were able to liquidate after 3 years. The first 3
Amazing.
couples, they
Yeah.
all own land now on their own.
That is
That's pretty great.
fantastic. You made
Yeah.
this happen. Great job.
And they too though, right? Like, so to be open-minded and just be upfront about everything, so then there's nothing that can get you in the back end, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And it is wonderful. Yeah, other things is like too, Maria, you and I have talked about the Kootenays being, having land that's unzoned.
Mhm.
So I can talk a little bit about that, the differences of zoning.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure. So that's kind of a big deal in tiny home circles because, as you know, tiny homes on wheels specifically are not recognized by a lot of municipalities as a dwelling. I would say most of them. So when it comes to trying to live in a tiny home on wheels, then anywhere that you fall under municipal zoning, you're going to have problems. So a lot of people are actually looking at unzoned land,
that's right.
and a lot of it is in your area. So
Mhm.
would love to hear more about kind of how that works as well as how that's changing, because we talked about that a little bit as well.
That's right. So, yeah, our area is pretty varied and large, and lots of distances between places. And all the land in between municipalities, little towns, they are unzoned. And so, unzoned means that you can use the land however you want to. So, whether you want to put a RV park, you want to build a home, you want to build a duplex, or you want to build a fourplex, or put a business, or put a factory. So, there's no regulations on how to use the land.
Mhm,
If you wanna build things, you still have to go through and get permits.
mhm,
So you still have to do that bit. But it gives people lots of flexibility. If you were to buy a piece of land, say in where I live in the village of Caslow, um, most of the land is zoned residential, so it's single family or two family. So you can put a main home and maybe you could put a carriage home, or you
mhm,
could put a duplex, but you can't put something that's movable. And one of the reasons they don't want that is they can't tax you on it. If the structure is tied to the land, then they can charge taxation, gives the government more money, all of that kind of stuff, right? Um, but in unzoned, then you do have a lot more less restrictions, a lot more options. Um, to kind of give you an example of another 5 young people, so all in their 20s. They have limited funds. They were able to buy a piece of property, but they weren't able to develop it. They didn't put tiny homes. They didn't have the money to build it, but they just wanted a place to be for now.
Mhm.
And then we talked about it. And because you do have to go through the building permit process to build anything, and that is very expensive these days. Um, they talked about just making one building and putting a kitchen and a bathhouse. So cheaper because it's a small building, but it allowed the 5 people to figure out how to live, whether it was a tent or whatever they were doing, but then have a place where they could cook and they could keep clean, right? And have a washer and dryer. And then eventually they built, because it was what they could afford, they built like little bedroom cabins.
Mhm.
So it was like a cabin with no services. So that was cheaper.
Yeah, like a
Um,
bunkie.
yeah. And a little
Mhm.
sitting area and a little wood stove. And then they expanded on the kitchen and bathhouse and made a larger sort of sitting area where they could gather and have a communal space. And that has worked great for them too. They actually quite like it, so they're staying like that for now because it's very
Okay. Yeah.
affordable too.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, what a great little place, especially when the last few years there were people looking for ways to make income. So
Mhm.
that could have been a great short-term rental place or something like
Oh,
that
for
that could
sure.
still
It sounds like kind of a glamping space, right?
it is. That's
You
right.
can convert it into that very quickly if they wanted to do that.
Yes. And so that has worked for them and they're happy. So it's not that everybody's getting their dream home or their dream property. Um, so it's like putting that a little bit on the table and just focusing on owning land.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, and everybody's dreams are different and they change over time as well. So, like a lot of our readers are very kind of sustainability and eco-minded. So that may be their dream right there is to just live in the woods and kind of be off grid and commune with the gorgeous nature that is in that
that's
spot.
right. That is right. And that
Yeah,
is easier to do if you've got more rural places. But it's also like just thinking about, because nothing is easy either, right?
yeah,
Sometimes
yeah.
living off grid. I mean, you can get it set up and it's not cheap always to get it set up too, right?
Hmm.
But then if you have more than one person involved, then the cost becomes a shareable.
Yes, and that's actually one of the questions we had for you is when you're looking at buying a piece of land that is a lot of the times this land is very remote. There's nothing there that's being done. It's just kind of off the side of the road and it's
Yes,
forest.
that's right.
So what are kind of the costs that you should expect as a buyer on top of the cost of the land itself?
So, like hard costs, so you got the price of the land, and then
Hmm.
you do have closing costs. So that would be to pay a lawyer to change the title of the land into your name. So around here, it's you could look at about $2,000 for closing costs.
Hmm.
If you're a first-time home buyer, there is a property in BC, it's called property transfer tax. I think maybe in Ontario it might be called land transfer tax.
Yeah, yeah, we have something like that as well.
And it used to be that when you were a first-time home buyer, you were exempt. And now that's not the case.
Okay.
And to buy land-only properties, you are not exempt. So there is a taxation that the government charges every time a property is purchased,
Changing
and the
hands.
buyer has to pay it. Here in BC, it's 1% on the first 200,000
Hmm.
and then 2% on the balance. And then they have limitations. If it's valued $3 million, then you go into a higher taxation, and if it's over 5 million, you go into a higher one.
I think
Um,
in our group here, we're looking at like 100,000 or less.
yes, and so I'm not 100% sure about Ontario, but I know here in BC, if you're buying land only, you're not exempt. So you would have to
Okay.
pay the 1% on the first 200,000 if we're looking in
Mhm.
that kind of a price range, right? Yeah. And then the other costs are going to be if it is rural, remote, what is the access like? So you're going to have to develop access. I mean, sometimes you could do walk in for a little bit. Um, and then if you're going to do off the grid, what is that going to look like? Is it solar, um, micro hydro, all of those kinds of things, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but it is amazing how people can live with less to get yourself started. For example, even water, depending on where you're buying land. So here in our area, we're a temperate rainforest. So we actually get a certain amount of rainfall each year. And what we're seeing is people doing rain collection. some building cisterns and collecting rain. I have a
Mhm.
guy who's got three 1,500-gallon tanks buried in the ground, and he's designed the roof of his dwelling. So it's a very big roof, and that's how he uses it. If it's a very dry summer, you sometimes get a little bit paranoid about what you're going to do, but then he can fill them. He has a water bladder, or tanks.
Mhm.
You can go into the lake or whatever and pump water and then pump it back into his holding tanks.
Yeah.
Um, and power, like small solar panels are pretty amazing these days. Generators, depending on where you are again, because then people I know here have been experimenting with the wood boilers, like
Mhm.
outside in creating steam. Um, you do need some knowledge behind that though, right? To
Yeah.
get that going. But really at the end of the day, it's like if you can figure out to keep warm, cook food, it's a good start.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, the little wood stoves that people have in small dwellings, a lot of the time, because the dwellings are small, the ones that we deal with, you don't need that much energy to heat them.
That's right.
So the stoves are tiny also, and the amount of wood that goes in there is tiny.
That's right.
So it's like little sticks that would go inside there and actually keep the whole place warm. So it's definitely a lot of possibilities, and I think the tiny home builders in BC are very familiar with the possibilities. So if our readers will find those answers there. They've they've done it all. They've
Yeah, that's great.
insulated water lines. They've done the heating and the power and everything.
Yeah, that is pretty great.
Yeah, and so in terms of just owning land, like what are the benefits of owning land in very simple terms, just so that everyone's on the same page?
Well, I think security is one. We are seeing right now where people have bought homes during the pandemic because money was free and it was
Mhm.
very easy to borrow money. And now we've seen with the interest rates go up, there are a lot of people that are facing hardships
Yeah.
and they're turning and wanting to turn around and sell them. So then the people who were renting these second homes, people were buying second homes, vacation homes, and then renting them out. And now they don't have security. They're at the will sort of their landlord, right? So if the
Mhm.
landlord needs to sell, somebody else buys it, then the tenant has to be removed from the premises, right? They have to find
Right.
something else.
Yeah.
So owning land, you build that security in for yourself.
Mhm.
Um, and I also think just as human beings, like if we have that security of a place to be, then we can really concentrate on ourselves and what we're going to do with our lives. Without that, it's hard to make hardcore plans, right? Unless you're in some kind of tenement where they have it, I think like in New York City, where it's all rent controlled, the leases are very tight, then maybe,
Mhm.
but there's not very many places like that. And everything's changing because it's all about money, it seems like.
Yeah, yeah, and I think like you said, once your clients have the piece of property, then they're kind of secure there, and then over time, when they have funds, they can build a little bit more on that. If they don't, then they just stay as is, and there's kind of options long term there.
That's right.
In terms of selling land to kind of move on to that next
Yeah.
step, have you seen the land appreciate? Does it ever depreciate? Like, how does that work?
Mhm. So, I mean, the housing market all across Canada the last few years has been pretty hot. So it seems like most every piece of property has appreciated,
Mhm.
even with doing nothing on it. But a good way to appreciate your property is to bring services. So selling land is like if you could make sure that there's water or some kind of a septic sewage system, that adds value. If you have cleared areas that,
Mhm.
so somebody can develop it, that adds value. It's the holding power. If you can hold your land through the ups and downs of a real estate cycle, it typically used to be 8 to 10 years. In 8 to 10 years, you would see the market go up and down,
Mhm.
but it never has come down lower than what it was last time.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
it goes up, it comes down, and then it goes up and it comes down, but it never goes below. That's usually what's happened, unless
Mhm.
something devastating has happened to the area, or you know what I mean, like some natural disaster or something like that. But it always does appreciate. So if you can hold on for the long term, like in long term, like 10 to 20 years, if
Mhm.
you could hold it for 10 years in even what we're kind of experiencing now, a slowdown in real estate, it will be beneficial. You will realize
So
some
no matter
appreciation.
where you are in that cycle, you'll either gain a lot or gain a little bit less. But
That's right.
yeah.
We haven't seen, like I said, we haven't seen properties plummet. You
Hmm.
know, in the real estate world right this moment, there are people predicting sort of bad things, but then it's like housing always goes with population.
Yeah.
And we're seeing what's happening in Canada. I'm an immigrant, but I think our immigration, what's happening, I am not in favor of it. We don't have housing for the people that live here. And so to bring other people into our country and then we're competing with them. Um, I don't know how, I don't see a good end to that. We're seeing that in the cities. There's just not enough places to rent.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure. In the big cities, it's definitely a
but
problem.
it's
And
even here, it's becoming harder and harder, you know?
mhm,
And then it's just the costs. So as some of the people who have rental properties, their mortgage costs have gone up or
mhm.
property taxes. Like that's amazing. I'm so not a government person.
And we were just chatting before this call also about kind of so you were saying that a lot of this unzoned land is looking like the governments surrounding it are looking to zone it.
Yes,
So first of all, there's kind of a time limit on doing what you were planning to do potentially. But then when once you start paying taxes, then you have a voice in the municipality. So
that's right.
and you were saying like 40 people in your village means a lot,
Quite
like
a
that's
bit.
a big
So
voice.
we have 1,000 people as a
Mhm.
population base. So you've got 40 or 50 people that would approach our municipal government to want to let them know what their hardship is. They will have to listen because that's a substantial amount of our population.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and then those 40, 50 people can already go and talk to other people that live and get them on their side, show them what their feelings are, what their opinions are. So then when they also could influence the municipal government's direction, right? Um, it really is about empowering yourself. So even if you had to buy property that is zoned,
Mhm.
it's to know what does that allow you to do? Because you could change your plans to make it fit. Not all the time, but it's a way to explore it. Because if you can, then you can still make it work. I think what it is like to have whatever hard set ideas that we have about owning land and where and what we want to do with it, just put it aside for a minute and learn. So you want to buy a piece of land, you want to know what you can do on it and what you can't do on it. And if you can take your ideas and make it work, great. If not, then you will move on and try to figure out to buy land where you can do what you want to do.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I think like some of the things that we're seeing being done in Ontario with the like you said, you've the coach houses. Sorry, what do you call them in
That's
your
right. Carriage houses or
carriage
laneway
houses?
houses, coach
Sometimes
houses.
here they're coach houses or garden suites or ADUs
Right.
or laneways. They have a multitude of names, but overall, that's becoming a really big thing in Ontario municipalities. And what people are starting to think of doing, like you said, kind of taking a property and seeing what the possibilities are. They maybe will buy a property together with another family and then bring in a tiny home to be the ADU, like the additional dwelling unit, while the first family lives in a bigger home, or
Mhm.
potentially rent out the bigger home and both of them live in an ADU that they brought in. So it's kind of like there's multi-family, multi-generational options there that are very interesting.
That's right.
Sometimes it's like people who are retired wanting to downsize, they move into an ADU on their own property, and then that house is rented out or maybe kind of rented out to family or something like that. So there's definitely kind of options that are coming up that are like
That's
that.
right. And, just around that part of aging, sellers or people that
Mhm,
own property and maybe they need to move somewhere else because of their mobility issues or like you're saying, downsize. I've been talking to a few sellers and getting them because financing is hard for a lot
yeah,
of people these days. Um, Talking to sellers who own their home and don't need the income necessarily, but they won't mind some monthly income.
mhm.
And so talking them into holding mortgages for people, because then there's a lot of flexibility that way. So
Yeah,
they
so
get
hosting an ADU, that is your home, but then you own the home and then they own the land kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right. But even if it was a home built
Mhm.
on, and then they could hold a mortgage and they can get a monthly income, then they don't it helps them out just with whatever income they might be getting because people get retirement income.
Yeah.
And it is like that, just going around and exploring all of those different options because what I've been telling some of my sellers is like banks are making money hand over fist. Why wouldn't you? Because
Mhm.
you can. Yes, there's risks involved, but I think everything involves risks, right?
Well, and like you said in the beginning, once you take the risks and you put them down on the table
That's
and
right.
everyone talks to them as if they've already happened.
That's right.
It's like, what are next steps once this happens? Then you can really address that and feel more secure.
Yes, and housing is something everybody can relate to.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat about just land prices in your area and, for example, a waterfront lot or a not waterfront, and what are kind of the prices?
Mhm. So waterfront properties here, I mean, I think easily $300,000, you could say, for something under an acre,
Mhm.
not developed.
Yeah.
But then you can go kind of like our highway runs along the lake.
Mhm.
There's properties on the lakeside, and then you have properties on the mountainside. So, for example, I have 11 acres. We just took it
Which
off the
mountainside doesn't sound that bad to me.
No, it's still it is really nice. I think
It
sometimes
sounds
when you're
quite
looking
nice,
at
yeah.
properties where lakes are, I also see people get caught up in wanting to have a view or have lakeshore property, and I always tell people too, like, that's great, and if you can afford it, hands down, do it. But instead of holding out for something that is affordable in that sort of realm, buy something that you can afford that doesn't maybe have a view because you'll save a lot of money. You could probably spend more time in the view than looking at it.
Exactly, yeah, you can walk to the view.
Totally, right? Or you could
If you're
buy a little
done,
fishing
yeah.
boat and go in the lake rather than looking at it all the time.
Yeah,
But just to kind of give you, I have 11 acres um, for $215,000. It's
yeah,
unzoned and there are
mhm.
no services.
11
There's
acres, yeah,
Yeah,
that
and
is
there's potential to
quite
drill a
big.
well.
Yeah,
There's power lines that go by, so if you wanted to hook into the grid, you can. But something like that, I mean, so even 3 or 4 people, that's 11 acres. You can figure out something for
you won't even
privacy.
see them, yeah.
Exactly. You know? And so then that becomes much more affordable. Then you're looking at 60, 70, $80,000 a person.
Right,
Um,
yeah. Well, the
how can you go
properties
wrong?
that when we met, we kinda had 2 properties, I think, that you were selling, and were they something like 30,000 or
Mhm.
very, very cheap? And
Yes.
more remote, of course, but
But those 30,000 are just a lot. So 50
mhm.
feet by 110, and not always the terrain you will have to figure out because some of them have steep parts to it, but it's within walking distance to
We're
the
being
village.
creative here today.
Yeah, but, you can walk to town,
Yeah, yeah,
and that's great. Water you have to figure out, but then on the other hand, it's like if you can afford to buy something for $30,000, well, then maybe you might be able to figure out to put in a water system. Like I say,
yeah,
hauling
there
and
might be more
collection.
room for those improvements that you wanted to make
Exactly.
to the lot,
That's right.
so it's kind of
You
a
know,
trade-off.
another sort of popular thing that people have been doing out here is, because tiny homes also cost money to build, right?
Mhm,
But there's a few families, they've built, like, platforms, and then they've got those hunting tents.
mhm.
They're canvas, and they
Yeah,
come with
yeah,
a
the
wood
heavy
stove.
duty tents, yeah.
Yeah, so they're putting those on and putting a bit more of a solid cover for snow and living in that until they figure out.
Yeah,
My
we have
brother-in-law lives in
we
one.
have a comment here saying, "Take my money." People are excited. Well, it's a lot of our readers are in Ontario, so we like to kind of talk about what goes on in other parts of Canada as well, because it's very different.
Yes,
And
my
the
family actually just took a cross-country trip. We rented a RV from Calgary and drove to Toronto for a family wedding
wow,
just a
yeah,
few weeks
you saw
ago.
it all.
Yeah, and that is what I realized, our country is so big and
Yeah,
so varied. So
and
coming
people live
from
so differently
mountains
in
to
different places.
flat, and then Northern Ontario is just beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. So they're mentioning that they checked the prices in Caslo and 3 available lots are each over 150K. So I think those 30K lots were kind of a really good
There's
chance, which
still
is
some
why
of those
yeah,
are still there where people are not 100% sure if they wanna sell or not.
right. So basically, contact you to be in touch with the market
Yeah,
there.
and I think, you could look on my website too, because I put a lot of the other communities in the Kootenays, the East and West, kind of
Mhm.
what you can get, the average price, what kind of things are for sale there, just to kind of give an idea.
Can you
Another
give your email? Just I'm just going to it's
yeah,
call
so
at
you could
Kootenay
kootenaybc.com.
bc.com. There we go. That way people can maybe sign up for something from you so that they can stay in touch with what's
Yeah,
going on.
absolutely, for
Because
sure. That
yeah,
does
30,000 doesn't come up often. How long did it take to sell those lots actually?
it actually took a little bit of time, believe it or
Oh,
not,
okay. Yeah.
because it's very
A very
specific.
specific buyer.
It is. And then because some of them weren't flat, so then it's
Mhm.
like, yeah, you need somebody who's like 20, 25 years old who doesn't mind hoofing it up for a little
Yeah.
while, or snowmobile or dirt bike up or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, and they don't need their fitness club after
That's right.
that.
That is
They have
true.
buns of steel just going up and down to their home.
Yes.
Which here in Flatland, Ontario, we dream of having to go up some mountains or like
Aha. It's a luxury
give
here to
us some
find flat land.
height. Yeah, for sure. We actually have someone else commenting that they're looking at buying an existing small house and building a tiny in the backyard and renting out the main house. So fingers crossed for you on that.
Yeah, that's awesome. That really is, to get and have it be rented, so somebody's got housing, but
Someone
then
else
your
is gonna
mortgage
get
is getting
housing,
paid.
and you get housing, and everybody's happy and living the way that they wanted to live. So,
That's right.
yeah, that's amazing.
It is amazing. Yeah, there's quite a bit. I wanna say one other piece of property that I think that people should wrap their brains around. It's 80
Mhm.
acres. There's a ton
That's a
of
whole
building.
forest. Yeah.
It was on the market, I wanna say, at 500,000, okay?
Okay.
But it's 80 acres.
Yeah.
If like, that's 5 people, right, at
Mhm.
100,000,
5 people at
or
100,000.
10 people at 50,000.
You will not see those 10 people.
It's
Yeah.
and it's beautiful. Yeah, I think we should all go back to the land,
Mhm.
keep our hands busy, forget
Yeah.
about what's happening in the world, and I think it's just a great way to go.
Yeah, and honestly, when we interview people who buy land kind of in remote areas, a lot of times it's people who kind of ran out of options in the city and they went through some hard times. So it's very heartwarming actually to talk to them after they've made the move, whether they got like a container home or something, because everyone talks about how kind of rejuvenating the nature is.
It
Like
is.
these super gruff guys are telling me for 20 minutes about how they saw this fox or this deer or this moose or something. And it's so like we need that. We need to be close to the earth.
Absolutely.
So this
I mean,
being
that's way more, personal, so much more gratifying than talking
yeah,
about Kim Kardashian, you know?
for sure, yeah, and they're so excited about being able to wake up in the morning and go work on their land. Like, they're
Yes,
building something, they're constructing, they've got plans going multiple years ahead.
that's right.
So it's just really special to see that, and I think besides being kind of a creative way to afford something you couldn't afford in the city, it's also just you don't know how it's gonna affect you in so
That's
many
right.
positive ways.
That's right. That is right.
So I
Yeah.
think we have one more question, and then we're gonna
Okay.
wrap it up. You can mortgage a house, but not land. So if you don't have the money saved, is there a way to get a down payment for land only?
So
Can you
you
talk
can
about a little bit of the mortgaging?
for sure. So most land-only properties, the banks will lend you 50%. So you gotta come up with 50% of the down payment.
Mhm.
So if you're looking at $150,000 piece of property, you have to come up with $75,000. And that sometimes can be a hardship because that's a big chunk of money.
Yeah.
Um, that's where the co-ownership comes into play and that you could help each other out with, right? Because then it's
Mhm.
$35,000 each. Um, and then you also have to think about what it might cost you to develop the land, and is it something you can spread out over some time?
Yeah, and are the people buying it with you aligned on those costs as well? Like,
Are they, sorry, relying
are
on
they
this?
aligned on that cost as well?
That's
Like,
right.
are they willing to
That's right.
contribute half as you go forward? investing into the property, or is there kind of a different arrangement on that?
Yeah. Can I say one thing about mortgaging and talking to banks?
Sure.
I had a guy who gave me, I think, the best advice I've had somebody give me, and he had said to me that um, we always think that people with authority, like bankers, accountants, lawyers, government people, um, because they're in a position of authority, that we have to take what they say, right? And we always kind of go in at a lower than them. And what I've started telling people is, when you go to a bank, don't tell them maybe necessarily right off the bat of what you want and this is the house and blah blah blah, so then they can turn around and say, look at your financial picture and say no. It's so devastating. So
Hmm.
to figure out ways to empower yourself, so you walk into a bank and what you want to know from them is, if you're looking at land only or places with dwellings, what do I need to look like on paper for you to say yes?
That's great.
And they will
Yeah.
tell you. And then you can take that information and decide how it do some of those things check off for you, or what you
Hmm.
need to work at. Because when you have goals and you can work towards something, that makes it much more achievable than a bank just telling you no, and then you go away and going, okay, I need to get more money. Um, I think that when he said that to me, that made so much sense. And that's what I've done.
Yeah.
I've managed to purchase actually a building crazily, and only because I
Hmm.
went in there and I was like, "No, I'm not gonna tell you what I want. You tell me what I need to look like." And they told me, and I was able to get all of my
Get there. You
information
checked
and
it
put it
off.
into the
Yeah.
boxes that they wanted, you know?
That's fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's empowering. So when you feel empowered, you can achieve more things. And I think that's what I wanna see all of us do, is take our power back. All they want is our money. So we need to take our power back. We need to own land, and we need to show our faces into our local governments. So they're not just
Hmm.
looking at numbers, they're looking at people in their eyes and seeing, and they need to feel responsible for that, you know?
For sure. I love that message. That's a great closing for our event today. So thank you so much, Carl, for being here. I've provided Carl's email. I will do that as well in the email that goes out with this, so that you can get in touch with her if you're feeling like moving to Caslow. But otherwise, thank you so much for
You're very
spreading this
welcome.
message of empowerment across the country today. We're very, very happy to have you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and I'm happy to talk about, just mull around ideas. I'm happy to do that too.
Fantastic. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.